hit the record button, and then we'll be ready to go. All right, so we are picking up in 1 Samuel chapter 25, looking at the last section in the chapter, and I've entitled this section, David Notices Abigail's Worth, and we'll see how that comes to fruition, especially by the end of class tonight. So if we think about where we've been at, in chapter 25, we read about, again, David has basically, without being asked to do it, has helped Nabal out because he and his men have protected his flock. David didn't require, but David simply asked at the time of a specific feast that if Nabal has basically the extras that maybe his family doesn't eat, some of that could be given to his men since he helped protect Nabal's shepherds. And as we know, Nabal rejected, right, David's request. And we know that as Nabal's servant has said, as Abigail has said, Nabal's a pretty worthless fellow. Pretty worthless fellow, and that's how the Bible remembers him, especially by his name meaning folly. And we know that David, in response to that, acts with rage, right? And he goes and he tries to attack Nabal. And he tells his men, get your sword. Himself gets his sword. He tells his men to get his sword. And they're on their way to kill Nabal and all of his men. And who is it that steps in and intervenes? Abigail, right? Nabal's wife. As Abigail understood, Nabal's a worthless individual. He's not going to step up and do the right thing. So the task falls on me, so to speak, for Abigail. And so Abigail goes and she meets with David. And as we talked about last week, we looked at all the things that Abigail said to try to get David to relent or to not follow through with his plan to wipe out all of Nabal's household. And as we left off last week, what Abigail really does with David is she gets him to think about the long-term consequences of attacking and killing Nabal's household. And we talked about that specifically within verses 26 through 31, a few of the reasons why she wouldn't do that, or why she told David why you don't need to do that. Obviously, you're going to displease God. Obviously, you're going to jeopardize the gift that she's trying to give David that Nabal refused to give. She also talked about how, you think about God and how he works. God works in his own time. And if you step in and try to act as the servant of God where he's not asked you to be, you can prevent God from working in his own time. And then, of course, the final thing that we mentioned is, Abigail noted that you could jeopardize your kingdom at some point in the future. You don't have to, when you become king, you don't have to look back at this time and recognize that, you took a bunch of innocent lives to get to the throne, so to speak. And so you won't have to look back on this moment in time with regret. And so now we pick up verses 32 through 44, talking about basically David's response to Abigail, which includes noticing her worth. So again, a couple things to think about before we begin this section. One thing that I think we can reflect on in this section is the simple fact that, good things can happen to us when we are willing to admit we're wrong in life. Good things can happen to us when we are willing to admit we are wrong in life. You think about in the New Testament, how many people would have obeyed the gospel without admitting that they were wrong in certain aspects of their life? None, right? That's a principle of obeying the gospel, right? That we are in sin, we are imperfect, we need Christ in order to have salvation. And so you think back to examples in the New Testament, Acts chapter 2, right? Where you read about Peter's preaching and how, Peter tells the individuals there about the prophecies found in Joel and how that points to Christ being the Messiah. And at the end of that message was, again, you're the ones that put him to death, right? You're at fault for what has happened here. If you, the only people that you can blame for the reason why Jesus is not here with us today is it's your fault. And the response and the correct response that those people had to Peter and the other apostles was, what shall we do about this? What do we do about this? And we certainly know Peter talks about baptism and the process of salvation. But you go throughout all these accounts in the New Testament, and you think about Simon later on. Even though he'd already been baptized, he had to, in order to repent, he had to admit that he was wrong. And Peter said, again, you're bringing yourself back from a bad place. Paraphrasing there, but the point being is that sometimes good things can happen to us when we admit we're wrong. And as Christians, that's something that we always need to think about. We're not perfect in everything. I know it's hard for us sometimes to admit when we're wrong, but not only can we get things straightened and corrected, but just a good policy, a good policy of humility, right? Being able to admit when you're wrong. We'll talk about that with David tonight. Another point that we could think about is that God expects us to be wise in what He has blessed us with. God expects us to be wise with what He has blessed us with. The things that we have, they're not for us to go into, whether that's our talents, whether that's our money, whether that's our possessions. It's always a healthy mindset to keep in mind that really those things, in a sense, belong to God, because God has blessed us with those things. And we're not selfish about what we have. And we'll point that out when we talk about Nabal and the feast that he has in the following verses, because part of Nabal's problem is that he was very selfish in what he was blessed with. And we talk about how God looks down upon that. And so, looking at the text tonight, let's begin looking at verse 32. David's response to Abigail. And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me. And blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou which hast kept me this day from coming to shed blood and from avenging myself with mine own hand." And we'll stop there. Now, one thing to keep in mind again is that what has happened in verses 18 through verses 31, it's a longer explanation, but the basic premise is this. Again, David, you were wrong, right? You came, and that's our point, right? You came to Nabal to take his life, as we know, and as David will further illustrate here. But as we talked about last week, David saw himself as the servant of God, going to act as God's servant to get vengeance on Nabal. But Abigail, as we noted in verses 18 through 31, Abigail says, actually, in this situation, I'm actually doing what God wants because I'm withholding or I'm preventing you from going and taking revenge. And so when we look at this section of verses going forward, this is David basically saying, Abigail, I was wrong. Now, obviously, we think about what the way in which she said it. Obviously, Abigail, as we saw in those verses, sort of referred to herself as the handmaiden, and we'll see that more tonight. She put herself in a lower position than David. She was still going about it and telling, again, David that he was wrong in this situation. Now, add in the fact here that this is a woman that's correcting David. In this time, a lot of times in that day and age, it was not often expected for a woman to come out and to be maybe quite so bold as what Abigail was doing here. If you remember John chapter 4, when Jesus was traveling through Samaria, He sent His disciples to go buy food in the local city. And Jesus used that occasion to go and talk to a woman at Jacob's well, a woman from Samaria. Now, when the disciples came back as Jesus was talking to that woman, do you remember what John said about their reaction?
They were amazed he talked to a woman.
Yeah, they were amazed that Jesus was talking to a woman. Now, they thought within themselves about, why is Jesus doing this? And you go back and read John chapter 4, which records this. But generally, this sort of interaction was not seen as as common or perhaps as quite as acceptable as maybe it is today. You think about it. I'm not a husband, but most people in here that are men are, I believe, are husbands. But again, how do you feel about being corrected by your wife? Just think about it for a moment. How do you feel being corrected about your wife? Especially if it's something that you think you know a whole lot more about. It's one thing if you're being corrected on something you don't know very much, you're not very familiar with, but to be corrected on something in which you sort of see yourself as the expert compared to your wife, it's kind of a humbling thing. I don't think we kind of want to accept that. And I can't speak to that, but I can tell you, being corrected by my sister about something, sometimes it's hard for me to want to admit that she's right, but sometimes I have to do that because, again, she's right. And so sometimes it can be very hard to do that, but keep all of that in mind as David's responding here. He's been corrected by a woman, and you note how David responds to, again, Abigail basically telling him he's wrong. Verse 32, again, David said, "Abigail, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me." So in other words, David doesn't, cover his ears, tell Abigail to be quiet. He goes and he recognizes that she's right. Now verse 32, again, recognizing God's hand within all of this, you do keep in mind, right, that David's wrath has subsided. Right, that anger that motivated him to get his men ready to go and to kill Nabal and his household, that anger is completely gone away. And something else that we'll do tonight, this shows how David is different than Saul, right? Because if you remember, Saul got angry at David on 2 occasions and he tried to kill him, right? He threw the javelin at him. Same way with Jonathan, right? Saul had wrath at one point towards his own son, and he tried to kill him. Saul had wrath toward the priest of Nob, and Saul wiped them and their families out because Saul did not know how to control his own wrath. But David, on the other hand, knew how to do that. So when we think about why was David a man after God's own heart, when God made that statement in 1 Samuel 13:14, he was talking about David compared to Saul, or something set David apart from Saul. And it wasn't because David was perfect. It wasn't because David didn't make any mistakes in life, but it was because when David saw that he was in the wrong, he was willing to admit, I need to change. I need to fix myself. And that's what he's doing here. Unlike over and over again, Saul not doing that at all. Now note verse 33. Note where David again puts the blame, right? "Blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou which hast kept me this day from coming to shed blood, and from avenging myself with mine own hand." Where's David placing the guilt here? Himself, right? It was David who stirred up his men, right? It was David that was not acting as God's servant in this situation, or he was looking for personal revenge. Yet David puts all the blame on himself, right? He doesn't make excuses for his original, for what he initially thought. And part of admitting sometimes when we're in the wrong, we have to own up and accept we have to take responsibility for our own actions. Now you compare that again with Saul, 1 Samuel 15 verse 21. Who did Saul put the blame on when Israel did not destroy, or when he did not destroy the possessions of the Amalekites? Remember, Saul put that blame on the people. He tried to remove any responsibility that he had. But see, part of whenever we have to admit we're wrong, it's certainly admitting we're wrong, but it's also taking the responsibility for, the things that we've done to be in the wrong. Right? And that's a necessary part of repentance. You note again that you get that again, verse 33, that he wanted to avenge. Again, he says, avenging myself with mine own hand. Right? That was in contrast to, again, as we talked about last week, not avenging through God's hand, right? That's the idea again of personal revenge. You note too, verse 33, that the phrase "shed blood" in the Old Testament a lot of times is connected to the idea of murder. And let's go ahead and move to verse 34 and 35. So in verse 34, David continues and says, "For in very deed, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, which hath kept me back from hurting thee, except thou had hasted and come to meet me, surely there had not been left unto Nabal by the morning light any male." And so, again, right, David, he was on the pathway to shed blood, and as we note from verse 34, he was going to kill a lot of innocent people, because not all of Nabal's servants and men agreed with him at all. And all of these things would have happened unless Abigail had acted as the peacemaker, right? As we talked about last week, there's a need for peacemakers in society. You know, if Abigail had not acted in this way, there would have been a lot of loss of life, needless to say. But now David has acknowledged that whereas he thought he was a tool of God's providence, it was really Abigail all along. And he's willing to admit that he was wrong. So verse 35 is also pretty interesting here. Sometimes when we admit when we're wrong, you know, sometimes we do it, but we might not have the right attitude doing it. Or somebody can tell that, you know, we're really upset about being wrong. Even though we may admit it, we don't have the right attitude in response to it. We might hold a grudge against the person who proved us wrong. David doesn't do that at all. Verse 35, "David received of her hand that which she had brought him, and said unto her, Go up in peace to thine house. See, I have listened to thy voice and have accepted thy person." Now we know back in verse 18, all those gifts that were brought to David, the animals, the food that was provided, David takes them, right? He takes them in. And as we talked about last week, David had the best interest of his men. That was the whole reason why there was a conflict between David and Nabal, was because of these provisions that David wanted for himself and for his men. David had the best interest of his own men. And again, different from Saul, right? Where Saul, we think back to that oath made in chapter 14 where Saul jeopardized his men because he made an oath that they could not eat until they completely wiped out, I believe, the Philistines in that chapter. But David has the best interest of his men. He tells Abigail, "Go in peace to thine house." Or in other words, Abigail, I'm not going to attack Nabal's household. And so you draw that entire section through verse 35. When you draw that picture into a close, if David doesn't admit he's wrong, he's going to go forward and take a lot of innocent life. He's going to put himself, at least in jeopardy, of being in God's good standing. But because David is a man willing to admit he's wrong, you know, he's able to prevent himself from doing something that would have been very detrimental to himself. And now, verses 36 through 39, we're going to read that David's withholding his wrath pays off for David. All right, so verse 36, Abigail returns home. Verse 36, "And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing less or more until the morning light." Now, we talked about this at the outset, but there was a feast connected to this time. Whenever sheep were sent to be sheared, there was a feast connected to this. But in verse 36, I want you to pay attention to the specifics here of how Nabal's feast is described, because that's very important. First of all, I want you to note that Nabal did not seem to notice that there were some things missing from his livestock, from his possession. Right? There were some things that it appears that Nabal did not notice, that the gifts that Abigail took to David, it appears that he did not notice that they were missing. Now, preparing for a feast or preparing for a large meal, something that cannot happen as a spur-of-the-moment thing. I know You think about fellowship meals, you think about certainly things connected to a wedding reception, right? Those things take time to plan out. You got to figure out who's bringing what. You got to figure out, how much of a certain item are we going to need, and it requires a lot of planning. And the point being is that a feast like this for a holiday would have been something that was not spur of the moment. It needed to be planned out. But you don't read about here Nabal questioning, what happened to the 5,000 small cattle that have suddenly disappeared, or you don't read about what happened to the cakes and things of that nature. You don't read about any of that in this passage. Now you also note in verse 26, again, the feast was like a feast of a king. Now we know that Nabal was not a king, but the writer says that he had a feast like a king. Now we know that if you go back to 1 Samuel 8, we can read about all the things that the king, because he's king, would be able to do. But the idea here is that Nabal has a very lavish feast set before him. And that idea is continued with the fact that Nabal was very drunken. Now we think about the dangers of drunkenness, certainly. But in the Old Testament, the idea of drunkenness was often connected to the idea of having excess. We remember that in Amos chapter 4, we talked about the women who, it said, were drunken with wine. And we talked about how that connected towards those that were going without in Israel. Whereas the wives of some of these rich men basically had too much or had excess amount of things. And so what that description shows to us is that Nabal was completely unjustified by not helping David out. So it's not like Nabal could have said, David, I don't have enough for you because I have to take care of my own household. David, I'd be glad to help you out, but the fact of the matter is I only have enough food to be able to take care of my immediate household. That's not the picture here. The picture here is if Nabal's throwing the feast of a king, himself not being a king, he had a whole lot of food. He had a whole lot of extras. For someone to be able to have that amount of stuff, it's not as though Nabal could have said, we're just struggling to get by. We don't have the means to help you out, David. And David certainly knew that. So once you get in the picture of verse 36, Nabal's based on this type of feast, he's a very wealthy man, but he's very selfish in what he has. And I tie in here, this is a good example, a good tie-in with Luke chapter 12, where you read about the parable of the rich fool, right? And you read about he has so much grain that his immediate thought is he needs to build a bigger barn to be able to store that grain. He decides to, and I'm going to go over there and read one specific verse from that passage. He says to himself, eat, drink, and be merry. Everything is essentially taken care of. And of course we know that, and I've got it pulled up here. Let me pull up the King James real quick. He said, verse 20 again, right after he's talked about all the goods he's got and how he's got everything planned out, right? God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? Now notice verse 21, So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Right? The idea of selfishness. Here, you think about that verse, you think about here, Nabal's given the great opportunity of helping God's servant out, right? God's anointed out. And Nabal scoffs at that idea. He was rich towards himself, but not rich towards God in the case of helping out God's servant. And so, as we think about verse 36, the picture is this is a man that had more than plenty enough to be able to help out David and his men. Now, of course, you note that Abigail does not speak to Nabal that night, right? Wherefore, right, so the picture is she comes in, she sees that he's obviously very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing less or more until the morning light. Now, I will mention this. So I was looking at an article, or it was an excerpt from a book. It was comparing how much, and this is just a piece of information that I think is a little bit interesting, but it was comparing how much Abigail gave to David, and it was comparing it to a document that archaeologists discovered from about the same time that talked about how much Egypt provided to one of its small expeditionary forces that was sent to Palestine. And basically the equivalent, or the Egyptian expeditionary force was about 5 times greater in number than David and his men. But the stuff that was provided to David and his men by Abigail, and specifically those cakes that were mentioned, was about on the same level as that force, that Egyptian army force. And so the picture is, Egypt at that time, or at least a little bit before David's time, was one of the most powerful nations in that area. And if they were providing their men with about the same amount of goods that Abigail took to David, the idea is that Nabal's a very, very wealthy individual. And so that just sort of reemphasizes again verse 36. He's a man that is selfish with what he has, doesn't want to help out God's servant. So verse 37, Nabal sobers up, but it came to pass in the morning when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and he became a stone. So Abigail waits until Nabal has sobered up, basically. Obviously, you think about what has happened. Something very serious has obviously happened at this point because of how close Nabal came to death. And whether this is because Nabal is afraid of how close he's come to death, or whether this is out of his anger towards Abigail, whatever the case may be, we read that his heart died within him and he became as a stone. The indication from my understanding is that this would be a reference to a stroke here. I know some translations may have a heart attack, but from what I understand, the idea of becoming as a stone or not moving would have been more associated with a stroke. And so this is the fate of Nabal. I tied in here in this section 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, right, where Peter reminds Christians in his day to be sober, to be vigilant. And again, the idea of sober there is to be clear-minded, to be attentive to what's going on. It could have been that Nabal was a worthless man. Obviously, he was a worthless man, but part of that was because he didn't pay attention to what was going on around him. And so likewise, Peter's point there to Christians is, if you especially think in the case of drunkenness as what Nabal experiences here, drunkenness kept him from being aware of what was going on around him. It kept him. You think about the comparison there. Again, Abigail's the responsible one here, even though Nabal's supposed to be the head of his household. And so if you think about why is it that I need to be clear-minded, well, if I'm clear-minded, I can be attentive to what's going on around me. And Nabal, it's amazing how quickly his disposition changes from verse 36 to verse 37. I want you to note verse 37, that phrase, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, right, that his wife told him these things. The Hebrew word for wine bottle or wine skin is the word Nabal, which is Nebel. Now, if you know, what does that word sound or is spelled, what word is that spelled similar to? Nabal, right? Of course, a wineskin was an object that held wine. And there's actually, this is sort of a play on words here. In English, we don't pick this up, but you think about when the wine was gone out of Nabal, you think about how wine leaves a bottle. And the word Nabal and the Hebrew word for wine bottle were very similar. And if you read in the New Testament, Jesus had a parable that's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that contained a parable about the wineskins. And Jesus' point is that whenever wine is poured out of a wineskin, you don't put new wine back in it because the wineskin will burst. And so Jesus was saying something that they understood at the time. Once wine has left the wineskin becomes pointless. As Jesus said, its whole point at that point is to perish. And so likewise here, there's sort of a funny play on words. When the wine goes out of Nabal, just like a wineskin is worthless once the wine has gone out of it, the wine goes out of Nabal, he has a stroke, and as we see verse 38, go ahead and pull up verse 38, he perishes. And it came to pass about after 10 days that the Lord smote Nabal that he died. Now, why does the writer say that the Lord smote Nabal? Why is that important? Okay, right, the Lord had a hand in it. Why is that important to what we've been talking about?
David didn't take matters into his hands. He let the Lord handle it.
Right, David took the matter into his own hands. It also shows that, right, that God is on David's side. This is not just random. This is not just a coincidence that Nabal, suffers a stroke after he does David this great dishonor. Right? Some people could have said, God didn't really have a hand behind this. This is just a coincidence that all these things happen the way that they did. The writer says that the Lord smote Nabal that he died. It shows again that God, as Abigail pointed out last week, it shows that God was going to fight some battles for David. He was going to help David out. Just as the Philistines came to David's rescue in 1 Samuel 23, and we talked about that being the providence of God. Here again, God delivers David by taking out Nabal. And so David is a man of God. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about so far?
I think it's wonderful, and you pointed it out, that the way Abigail handled David's wrong, she handled it the right way. If she'd walked up to David and just blurted out, "David, you're wrong," that just puts people on the defensive. Just hearing those words, "You are wrong," but the way she does it, with I guess we'd say diplomacy or tact, and the more she talked, the more that gave David time to think and to realize that she's right. And if we could only learn from that today, and if you want to bring up politics, the finger pointing and the name calling is childish and immature, and I think a lot of folks have just lost the sense of tact and diplomacy. Yes, I may be wrong, but show me in the right way when I'm wrong.
Right. Yeah. You're generally not going to get very far with somebody you disagree with if your first instinct is to come out and to attack them right away. Abigail didn't do that, and so she had a lot of success, or at least the situation turned out to be successful for David because I think in large part because of how Abigail handled it. And you note how David responds, verse 39. David hears Nabal was dead. He said, "Blessed be the Lord that hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and have kept his servant from evil. For the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head." David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife. Again, David recognizes that God has had a hand in this, right? God has fought for him. Again, that's the idea, that he hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal and hath kept his servant from evil, right? The providence of God has kept David from doing something wrong, so that for the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head, right? David did not see what has happened as a coincidence. He saw that God's providence was very much tied within it, because God, again, David was a man after God's own heart. Now you note, of course, something else here, right? David notes that God helped him avoid sin. Some people try to make the excuse, again, if something bad happens, or some people have a tendency, again, to blame God when things go wrong. And that's not necessarily just in a physical sense, but also things spiritually as well. Sometimes people have a habit to blame God for certain sins in their life, but the point is that, again, God doesn't tempt man, right? As 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, Paul told the church in Corinth, right, the things that, and what he essentially says there, the things that you face, right, those temptations that you face are common. People have all experienced that, and God's role is that he helps provide a way of escape from sin. And that's what David notes here, because it required David to admit that he was wrong, and that was his way of escape from committing sin. And sometimes that might be our response that we need if we deal with sin in life, to recognize maybe we're going about fighting this particular temptation the wrong way. Just as David had to be corrected, right, trying to fight that temptation the wrong way. All right, so the last section we'll look at, and we'll just look at this very briefly, but again, verses 40 through 44, you're going to note that David marries again. When the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spake unto her, saying, David sent us unto thee to take thee to him to wife. And she arose and bowed herself on her face to the earth, and said, Behold, let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. Let's just go ahead and stop. Let's go ahead and read through verse 44. And Abigail hasted and arose and rode upon the donkey with 5 damsels of hers that went after her. And she went after the messengers of David and became his wife. All right, so David marries again, right? So Abigail's husband has died in the Old Testament and really in the first century as well. It was generally not acceptable for a woman to remain single if her husband has died. If she's young enough, she can remarry. But there came a certain age, and I believe that was the age of 60, that the wife would fall under the responsibility of her children or somebody else to take care of her. And based on Deuteronomy 25, which is where we get which talks about when when the wife of a husband dies, it's usually the husband's brother that has the responsibility of marrying his former sister-in-law. And that's Deuteronomy 25. Apparently, Abigail didn't have really any close family connected to either side, and so there's no one there's no one there to take her hand in marriage. And so David steps in, and we know that Abigail's a very virtuous woman. That's been pointed out to us, but also keep in mind that there is a political reason why David would have married Abigail. Right, Nabal, as we've talked about, he was a descendant of Caleb. He came from one of the more distinct families in that area. Again, his family would have held a lot of weight in that area. And David basically marries into this because he marries Abigail. Today, if you marry, hypothetically, if Bill Gates had a daughter and I married her, right, I would marry into the Gates family. That would be a lot different than marrying into somebody that was from around here. That's sort of common in a way, right? I would be marrying into a lot more in that situation. Well, it's sort of the same idea, right? David's marrying into a pretty prestigious family, and this will help explain why, when we get to 2 Samuel 2, that the first place that announces David as king of Israel will be in Hebron, in this area, because of his connections to this area. You note again that Abigail accepts that proposal. She just a couple things I'll mention. One thing I'll just mention about that. You notice how reverent she was towards David. She bowed herself to the servants of David when they came to meet her. Because you think about it, when Abigail becomes the wife of David, Abigail's elevated a little bit above the servants. When Joseph and Potiphar, right, Potiphar listened to his wife first before he listened to Joseph, who was the head servant in his house, because Potiphar's wife held a rank above Joseph in that sense. And so you get the idea of how grateful Abigail is because of her actions here, right? She washes the feet of the servants. Again, very grateful. And she goes and with her handmaids goes and marries David. We'll just briefly mention this at the beginning of next week. We'll talk a little bit about who Ahinoam, I can't even say the word tonight. Ahinoam. I'll have to work on that next week. Verse 43, the other wife that David takes. We'll also talk about what happened to Michal as well. And this may help us understand why David takes two more wives when we talk about what has happened to Michal. But we'll save that towards next week. We'll pick up in verse 43 next week. Are there any comments or anything that we want to add on to what we've talked about tonight? If not, we're going to go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up briefly in verse 43, but we'll get into chapter 26 next week.